Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. November in Oregon means darkness creeps in before dinner, and that Wednesday was no exception. I'd just finished my last class at Portland State, a 3-hour seminar on Victorian literature that always left my brain feeling like mush, and all I wanted was to get home, make some ramen and crash on the couch with Netflix. My roommate Kelsey had gone to her parents' place in Eugene for the week. Something about her mom's birthday, so I had the whole rental house to myself. We'd been living in that little 2-bedroom place near Belmont for about 6 months, one of those old craftsman houses from the 20s, with creaky floors and windows that rattled whenever a bus drove by. My parents kept asking if I felt safe living there, especially with all the break-ins happening around campus lately. But honestly, I loved that house. It had character, you know? Original hardwood floors, this gorgeous built-in bookshelf in the living room, and a huge backyard with an apple tree that actually produced edible fruit. Walking up the front steps around 5:10, I remember thinking how weird it was that the porch light wasn't on. I was pretty sure I'd flipped it that morning, but maybe I'd forgotten in my rush to catch the bus. My keys jangled as I fumbled with the lock in the growing darkness, and when I pushed open the door, the house felt different somehow. Not wrong exactly, just different. Like when you walk into a room and everyone stops talking, that kind of heavy silence. I dropped my backpack by the door and reached for the light switch, squinting as the overhead fixture flooded the entryway with harsh yellow light. My sneakers squeaked on the hardwood as I headed toward the kitchen, already mentally debating between chicken or shrimp-flavored ramen, when I noticed my bedroom door at the end of the hall was open. Not wide open, just cracked about 6 inches, enough to see the fading daylight filtering through my window. That gave me pause because I'm obsessive about closing doors, always have been since I was a kid. My older brother used to tease me about it, calling me the door police whenever I'd go around the house making sure everything was shut tight before bed. I stood there for a second, telling myself maybe I'd been in a rush that morning, maybe I hadn't pulled it all the way closed. But then I saw them, my curtains, the thick burgundy ones I'd bought at Target specifically because they blocked out the morning sun. They were open about a foot in the middle, creating this narrow gap where anyone walking by could see straight into my room. I definitely, absolutely, 100% had closed those before leaving. I remember doing it because I'd noticed my neighbor across the way, this guy who worked nights at the hospital, getting home right as I was getting ready, and I didn't want him seeing me change. My phone buzzed in my pocket, that specific double vibration that meant the security camera app was sending an alert. Kelsey's dad had installed this cheap camera system when we moved in. Nothing fancy, just a doorbell cam and one overlooking the driveway. The notification read, "Person detected at front door," which seemed weird since I'd just walked through there myself. Then another buzz, "Motion detected in driveway." Another, "Multiple persons detected." My throat tightened as I opened the app, waiting for it to load. But instead of showing me the live feed, it just spun and spun before displaying "camera offline." I tried refreshing it, even closed the app completely and reopened it, but got the same message. The timestamp showed it had gone offline at exactly 5:14, about 3 minutes after I'd walked through the door. I moved toward the kitchen, every nerve in my body suddenly awake and screaming at me to pay attention. The house was too quiet, that kind of thick silence where you can hear your own heartbeat thudding in your ears. I reached for the kitchen light switch, and as the fluorescent tubes flickered to life, I caught movement outside the window above the sink. Just a flash of something dark against the fence line. I stepped closer to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the glare from the overhead light. And that's when I saw him. A man standing in my backyard, positioned right behind the apple tree facing the house. He wasn't moving, wasn't trying to hide, just standing there with his arms at his sides like he was waiting for something. The last traces of daylight made him more silhouette than person, but I could tell he was tall, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie, and he was definitely watching my house. My first instinct was to duck down below the window, which I did, practically throwing myself onto the linoleum floor. I crawled on my hands and knees to the hallway, my mind racing through options. Call 911, run out the front door, lock myself in the bathroom. From my position on the floor, I could see straight through to my bedroom, and with the lights now on in the kitchen and hallway, the window had turned into a perfect mirror. But I knew what that meant from the outside looking in. Before I'd turned on the lights, anyone in that backyard could see everything inside my room through that gap in the curtains. They'd probably watched me walk through the house, seen me go to the kitchen, knew exactly where I was. My fingers fumbled with my phone as I dialed 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I whispered my address to the dispatcher. While I was on the phone with the dispatcher, explaining in a shaky whisper that someone was in my backyard, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the sliding glass door in the dining room being tested. That specific metallic rattle it made when you pulled on it while it was locked. I'd locked it that morning, right? God, I'd locked it, I was sure I had. The dispatcher was asking me questions, her voice calm and professional. But all I could focus on was that sound. Then it stopped. Everything went quiet again except for my own ragged breathing. I pressed myself against the wall in the hallway, phone clutched to my ear, when I heard footsteps on the back deck, slow and deliberate, moving from the sliding door toward the kitchen window. He was checking every possible entry point, and he wasn't even trying to be quiet about it. Like he wanted me to know he was there, wanted me to hear him looking for a way in. The dispatcher told me units were on their way, maybe 4 minutes out, to stay on the line and find somewhere safe to lock myself in. 4 minutes might as well have been 4 hours. I started crawling toward the bathroom, the only room in the house with a lock that actually worked properly, when I heard something that made me stop cold. Voices, plural. There was more than one person out there. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like 2 distinct male voices having a conversation in my backyard. Casual as could be, like they were discussing weekend plans instead of breaking into someone's home. Then I heard one of them laugh, this short, sharp bark of a sound that made bile rise in my throat. They weren't nervous or rushed. They were enjoying this. I made it to the bathroom and quietly closed the door, turning the lock as slowly as possible to minimize the click. The dispatcher was still talking, telling me to stay calm, that officers were close, but her voice sounded distant and tinny through the phone speaker. I sat on the cold tile floor with my back against the bathtub, knees pulled up to my chest, trying to control my breathing. Then came the sound I'd been dreading, breaking glass. Not loud and dramatic like in movies, but a careful, deliberate crack, followed by the tinkling of pieces being removed. They were coming in through my bedroom window, the one with the curtains they'd deliberately left open. I could hear them clearly now, one of them saying something about watching for neighbors, the other responding that the street was empty. Their voices were so calm, so matter-of-fact, like they'd done this 100 times before. The footsteps inside my house made a different sound than mine ever did. Heavier, more purposeful, accompanied by the creak of floorboards I didn't even know could creak. I heard dresser drawers being pulled open in my bedroom, the contents dumped out, then the closet door banging against the wall. They were looking for specific things, valuable things, and they were moving fast now. One set of footsteps headed toward Kelsey's room, while the other moved down the hallway toward where I was hiding. The bathroom doorknob rattled. Just once, a quick test to see if it was locked. I held my breath, my entire body rigid with fear, the dispatcher's voice a distant mumble I could barely process. The footsteps paused right outside the door. I could see the shadow of feet in the gap underneath, 2 dark shapes against the hallway light. He stood there for what felt like forever but was probably only 10 seconds. Then I heard him say to his partner, "She's in here." Not a question. A statement. He knew exactly where I was. That's when the sirens started, faint at first, but growing louder by the second. The feet under my door shifted immediately, and I heard the guy curse, something sharp and angry. His partner called out from the other room, just one word, "Go!" The footsteps pounded back down the hallway, no longer trying to be quiet, and I heard them scrambling through my bedroom. Something heavy fell and crashed, probably my lamp, then more glass crunching under their feet as they went back out the window. The sirens were screaming now, definitely on my street, and through the small bathroom window I could see red and blue lights painting the walls. I stayed frozen on that bathroom floor, couldn't move even when I heard the police officers announcing themselves at the front door. The dispatcher kept telling me it was safe, that I could come out, but my legs wouldn't work. It took 2 officers calling my name through the door before I finally managed to unlock it, and when I saw them standing there in their uniforms, I completely broke down. Later, after giving my statement and watching crime scene techs dust my bedroom window for prints, one of the detectives pulled me aside. Detective Hobbs, an older woman with gray streaks in her hair and tired eyes, told me I was lucky. They'd been tracking this crew for 3 weeks, she said. 5 guys working together, specifically targeting young women living alone or with female roommates. They'd scout the houses for days, learn the routines, wait for that perfect window right at dusk when people got home from work or school. The darkness gave them cover, but more importantly, that's when people turn on their lights without thinking to close their blinds first, turning their windows into one-way glass. You can't see out, but anyone outside can see everything in. They'd hit 7 houses already, always entering through bedrooms, always when the victim was home but isolated in another part of the house. The crew would panic and run if they heard sirens, which is the only reason I wasn't face-to-face with them that night. Detective Hobbs said they caught 2 of them 3 blocks away, still had jewelry from my bedroom in their pockets. The others got away, but with the evidence they found, it was enough to connect them to all the other break-ins. She kept saying I did everything right, calling 911 immediately, hiding, staying on the line. But all I could think about was those 10 seconds when he stood outside my bathroom door, knowing I was there, deciding what to do next. October in small-town Indiana brings out everyone for the annual Fall Festival, and that Saturday was no exception. I'd been running the ticket booth at Garrett's farm since noon, watching families stream through with their kids dressed in costumes even though Halloween was still 2 weeks away. My daughter Chloe had just turned 7 that September, and she'd been begging me all week to let her go through the corn maze with her friend Alyssa from school. Around 4:30, when my shift was almost over, I finally caved and told them they could go while I finished counting the register. Garrett's maze was famous in our county. 10 acres of corn designed by some company from Chicago that specialized in these things, with paths that twisted and split into dead ends that even adults got lost in for an hour sometimes. Alyssa's mom, Beverly, had volunteered to walk them through while I wrapped up my shift, and I watched them disappear into the entrance, Chloe's purple jacket bright against the browning corn stalks. Beverly was the type of parent who had GPS trackers in her kids' shoes and made them wear helmets to ride scooters in their own driveway, so I figured if anyone would keep them safe, it would be her. I could hear the festival winding down around me, vendors starting to pack up their crafts, the band on the main stage announcing their last song, and I remember thinking we'd timed it perfectly because the maze closed at 5 and we'd missed the parking lot chaos. I was wiping down the counter when Beverly came running toward me, her face completely drained of color, asking if Chloe had come back to find me. She explained in this rapid, breathless way that they'd been about halfway through the maze when Chloe said she needed to use the bathroom really badly. Beverly told her to wait just 5 more minutes until they got out. But Chloe was doing that dance kids do when they really can't hold it, so Beverly pointed to the exit sign they could see above the corn, maybe 50 feet away through the stalks. She told Chloe to walk straight toward it while she kept Alyssa with her on the path, figuring they'd meet at the exit in 2 minutes max. But when Beverly and Alyssa came out, Chloe wasn't there, and the teenage worker at the exit said no kid in a purple jacket had come through. Beverly ran back into the maze, calling for her, then came to find me, certain Chloe must have gotten turned around and found her way back to the ticket booth somehow. We got the maze supervisor, a guy named Carl who'd worked at Garrett's for 15 years, and he immediately called all 5 workers stationed inside the maze on their walkie-talkies. None of them had seen a little girl in purple, but Carl didn't panic, just switched to his manager voice and told them to do a systematic sweep, starting from the exit and working backwards. He explained to me that kids got separated from their parents at least twice a day during peak season. Usually they just sat down and cried until someone found them. Never took more than 10 minutes to locate them. But 20 minutes passed, then 30, and the workers kept radioing back with nothing. No sign of her anywhere, not even crying or calling out, and I could see Carl starting to sweat through his flannel shirt, even though the temperature had dropped to maybe 60 degrees. By 5:15, Carl had called the police and shut down the entire festival. Nobody in or out, and they'd brought in everyone who worked at the farm plus volunteers from the crowd to form a human chain through the maze. We walked slowly, arms stretched out, touching the corn on both sides, making sure we didn't miss any small paths or spots where a kid might have curled up. The sun was setting fast, that October light that goes from golden to dark in what feels like minutes, and people had their phone flashlights out, calling Chloe's name over and over until our voices went hoarse. I kept expecting to hear someone shout that they'd found her. Maybe scared, but okay. Maybe she'd fallen asleep somehow, even though that made no sense. But the shouts never came, just more voices joining the search as word spread through the crowd of remaining festival goers. The police brought in dogs around 6, 2 German shepherds that specialized in tracking, and they had me give them Chloe's sweater from my car to get her scent. Watching those dogs work through the maze, their handlers following with heavy-duty flashlights, made everything feel suddenly official and terrifying, in a way that knocked the wind out of me. They traced her path from the entrance, following the exact route Beverly had described. Then the dog stopped at this spot maybe 40 feet from the exit, circling and whining, and the handler said this was where her trail went cold, just completely disappeared. He kept using phrases like scent cone and track contamination, but what he was really saying was that Chloe's smell just stopped existing at that spot, like she'd been lifted straight up into the air. The detective in charge, a woman named Diane Foster who had kids of her own, and kept touching my shoulder while she talked, told me they needed to review the security footage immediately. Garrett's farm had installed cameras 2 years earlier, after someone tried to sue them over a broken ankle, mostly covering the main areas where liability issues might happen. We huddled in the farm's office, this cramped room that smelled like fertilizer and old coffee, watching grainy footage on a monitor from the camera that covered the maze exit and part of the parking area. Detective Foster fast-forwarded through hours of families going in and out, kids running around, until we got to 5:02 p.m., just after the maze closed, and she told me to watch carefully. At first it just looked like the usual end-of-day crowd, people heading to their cars with tired kids and bags of kettle corn, everyone bundled up as the evening got colder. Then Foster pointed at the screen and rewound it, playing the same 15 seconds over and over, and I saw what she was watching. This person walking out of the maze's exit carrying what looked like a heavy bundle wrapped in a barn jacket, the red and black plaid kind half the men in town owned. The figure kept their head down, a baseball cap pulled low, moving with the crowd but somehow separate from it, walking steadily toward the parking lot while everyone else was stopping to chat or wrestle kids into car seats. The bundle in their arms was the size of a child, covered completely except for what might have been a small foot in a pink sneaker hanging out at one corner, and I heard myself make this sound. Not quite a scream, but close. Foster had her tech guy enhance the footage as much as possible, but the person had clearly known where the cameras were, keeping their face angled away, using the crowd as cover. They'd timed it perfectly, walking out just as a church youth group was leaving. 30 or 40 teenagers all bunched together, making it impossible to track where the figure went once they hit the parking lot. The other cameras showed fragments, a shoulder here, the edge of the bundle there, but never a clear shot of the person's face or their vehicle. Foster pulled up footage from earlier in the day, trying to find someone casing the maze, watching for kids, And that's when she found something that made her call in the FBI. These 3 other incidents at fall festivals in surrounding states over the past 4 years, all of them with the same pattern. Each time it was a small-town festival with a corn maze, always in October when the crowds were biggest and daylight was fading by late afternoon. A child between 6 and 8 would vanish inside the maze just before closing time, and security footage would show someone carrying a bundle out, blending with the crowd, impossible to identify. In 2 cases, the children were found within 48 hours, dropped at rest stops hundreds of miles away, traumatized but physically unharmed, with no memory of what happened after someone approached them in the maze holding a cloth that smelled sweet. The 3rd child, a boy from Ohio, was never found, and his case had been cold for 2 years. Foster showed me the footage from those festivals, and even though the images were from different states, different years, the way the person moved was identical. That same deliberate walk, the same way of holding the bundle, like they'd practiced it. The FBI set up a command center in Garrett's barn, agents arriving within 3 hours, treating the whole farm like a crime scene. They had software that analyzed the figure's gait and body proportions, determining it was likely a man between 5'10" and 6 feet tall, athletic build based on how easily he carried the weight. They tracked every vehicle that left the parking lot using traffic cameras from town. But there were over 300 cars, and the suspect had probably switched vehicles or had fake plates ready. While they worked, I sat in the police station with Beverly, who couldn't stop crying and blaming herself, saying she should have just let Chloe pee in the corn. Dignity didn't matter. Why did she care about stupid rules when her job was to protect my child? Around midnight, an agent told us they'd received a tip from a gas station attendant in Kentucky who'd seen a man buy supplies around 7 p.m., acting nervous, with what sounded like a child crying in his van. They found Chloe at a rest stop near Louisville at 3 in the morning, sitting on a bench by the vending machines, still wearing her purple jacket but dizzy and confused. The doctors said she'd been drugged with something that affected her memory, probably chloroform initially, then something else to keep her quiet during the drive. She remembered walking toward the maze exit, then someone calling her name, saying her mom had sent them to get her, and after that just fragments, the smell of pine air freshener, country music playing low, stopping somewhere with bright lights. The man had left her with a juice box and a note in her pocket that just said "Lucky Number 2", which made the FBI agents exchange looks that told me we'd gotten unbelievably fortunate. They never caught him, though they connected him to 7 different attempts over 6 years, realizing he'd gotten better at it over time, learned exactly how to exploit those busy October evenings when tired parents and overwhelmed workers created just enough chaos for him to operate. My parents both worked at the medical center downtown, which meant they never made it home before 6:30, sometimes 7 if traffic on Highway 94 backed up. Being 17 and having my license for barely 8 months, I drove myself to school and got home every day around 3:30 to an empty house. My older sister had moved into her college dorm in August, so for the first time ever I had nearly 3 hours of complete solitude every weekday afternoon. I'd usually heat up whatever Mom left in the fridge, scroll through my phone at the kitchen counter, then head upstairs to finish homework or play games until I heard the garage door rumble open. We lived on Cedar Ridge Drive, one of those streets where people still hung American flags year-round, and the biggest excitement was when the Johnsons got their driveway repaved in September. Normal, boring, safe, exactly the kind of place where you wouldn't expect to discover someone had been living in your basement. Monday afternoon felt routine when I walked through the front door, tossed my keys on the hall table, and headed to the kitchen for food. While waiting for the microwave to finish heating my leftover chicken and rice, I noticed the basement door standing open maybe 2 inches, just enough to see darkness beyond. Dad always insisted we keep it closed to save on heating costs, especially now that November had brought that sharp Minnesota cold that made your nose hurt when you breathed too deep. I pushed it shut without much thought. assuming Mom had grabbed something from the freezer downstairs before leaving for work that morning. 20 minutes later, after finishing my food and heading to the garage for a Dr. Pepper, I walked past the door again and saw light seeping out from the gap at the bottom, a thin yellow line against the dark hardwood floor. I stood there for a second, staring at that strip of light and trying to remember if I'd actually seen darkness when I closed the door earlier, or if my brain had just filled in what I expected to see. The switch for the basement light sat at the top of the stairs, so someone would have had to flip it after I shut the door. Maybe Dad had installed one of those timer things he'd been talking about, something about saving electricity, though it seemed weird to put it on the basement lights that nobody used during the day. I opened the door, reached around the frame to hit the switch, and heard the click as the light turned off. The basement went black, that thick kind of darkness that seemed to press against your eyes. I closed the door again, made sure it latched properly this time, and headed upstairs to my room. Wednesday brought the same thing, except this time I knew for certain the lights had been off when I first closed the door, because I'd specifically checked. After school, I found the door open again, maybe 3 inches this time, enough that I could see the wooden stairs descending into shadows. No light this time, but when I went to close it, I caught a smell drifting up from below, something musty mixed with what reminded me of the camping gear Dad stored in the garage, that synthetic sleeping bag smell. I actually went halfway down the stairs, squinting in the dim light from the doorway, trying to see if maybe a pipe had burst, or if we had water damage somewhere. Everything looked normal from what I could tell, just the usual basement stuff like the old couch we'd replaced last year, cardboard boxes labeled with my sister's name, the ancient treadmill Mom kept swearing she'd start using again. By Friday, I'd started taking pictures with my phone every time I closed the door, just to prove to myself I wasn't going crazy. At 3:42 p.m., I had a photo showing the door completely shut, the white paint of the door frame visible on all sides. At 4:15 p.m., when I came downstairs to grab my charger from the living room, the door stood wide open, probably 6 inches, and I could hear something that made me stop dead in the hallway. Footsteps, or what sounded like footsteps, that slow, careful kind, when someone's trying to be quiet on creaky floorboards. Our basement had this old linoleum floor that made a specific sticky sound when you walked on it, like peeling tape off paper, and that's exactly what I heard echoing up from the darkness. My first thought wasn't even about an intruder, honestly, because that seemed impossible in our neighborhood, where Mrs. Patterson across the street practically ran a surveillance operation from her living room window. I convinced myself we had some kind of animal problem, maybe a raccoon that figured out how to get in through a window well or something. They were smart, right? Could probably push doors open, make weird noises, leave smells behind. I grabbed a broom from the closet, held it like a baseball bat, and called down into the basement in my deepest voice, trying to sound way bigger and older than a skinny teenager who weighed maybe 140 pounds soaking wet. Nothing responded, but I heard movement, a shuffling sound like something dragging across the floor near the back wall where Dad kept his tools. I backed away from the door, pulled out my phone, and searched for animal control numbers while keeping my eyes on that dark opening, terrified something would come charging up those stairs. The animal control guy showed up 45 minutes later, this older man named Frank, who looked like he'd been doing this job since before I was born, complete with thick canvas gloves and a pole with a loop on the end. He asked me a bunch of questions about what I'd heard and smelled, nodding like he'd dealt with this exact situation 100 times before. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from his truck, one of those metal ones that could probably double as a weapon, and told me to wait upstairs while he checked things out. I stood in the kitchen, practically pressed against the counter, listening to his heavy boots descending the stairs, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness below. For maybe 2 minutes, I heard him moving around down there, boxes sliding, his occasional grunt as he bent to look under something. Then I heard him say something that made my entire body go rigid, not a shout exactly, but this sharp, commanding voice. "Sir, I need you to stand up slowly and keep your hands where I can see them." My brain couldn't process what I was hearing because he'd said sir, not addressing some animal but talking to a person, a human being who had been in my basement. Frank's voice got louder, more urgent. I said, stand up now. I've already called the police and they're on their way. I heard scrambling, something crashing to the floor, and Frank came backing up the stairs fast. His hand on what I now realized was a can of pepper spray on his belt. Behind him, slowly, came another set of footsteps, and then I saw him. This man, probably in his 40s, wearing layers of dirty clothes, a beanie pulled low over greasy hair, his eyes darting between Frank and me like a trapped animal calculating escape routes. The man didn't run, though, just stood there at the top of the stairs with his shoulders hunched forward, breathing heavy through his mouth, this raspy sound that made my skin prickle. Frank positioned himself between us, telling me to go wait outside, but I couldn't move, couldn't stop staring at this stranger who'd been in my house, under my feet, while I'd been alone upstairs doing homework or playing video games. The man kept muttering something I couldn't quite make out, his voice rough like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days, maybe weeks. His fingernails were black with dirt, and I noticed he had a plastic grocery bag tied to his belt, bulging with what looked like food wrappers and empty cans. When he finally looked directly at me, his eyes were this pale blue color, almost gray, and completely empty of any emotion I could recognize, like looking at a mannequin that could blink. The police arrived within minutes, 2 officers who immediately took control of the situation, one talking to the man in calm, measured tones, while the other asked Frank and me to step outside. Standing on my own front lawn, watching more police cars pull up, I started shaking so hard I had to sit down on the grass. The officer, a woman with short red hair who introduced herself as Officer Brennan, knelt beside me and explained that they'd need to search the entire house, especially the basement, to understand what had been happening. She asked if my parents were coming home, and I managed to call my mom, barely getting the words out that someone had been in our house. I could hear her panic through the phone, saying she'd leave work immediately, asking if I was hurt, if I was safe. All I could tell her was that I was okay, even though I didn't feel okay at all, watching strangers in uniform going in and out of my house like it was a crime scene. My parents arrived at the same time, Mom practically jumping out of the car before Dad had fully stopped, running across the lawn to grab me in this crushing hug that made me realize how badly I needed it. The police had the man in handcuffs by then, sitting in the back of a patrol car, and Officer Brennan walked us through what they'd discovered. Behind our house, hidden by the overgrown juniper bushes Dad had been meaning to trim since summer, was a loose ventilation grate that led directly into the basement. The screws had been carefully removed and placed in a neat pile nearby, allowing someone to slide the grate aside and crawl through. Inside the basement, they found evidence he'd been coming and going for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. He'd made himself a sleeping area behind the water heater, using an old sleeping bag he must have brought with him, had a collection of our canned goods stacked against the wall, and had even run an extension cord from our outlet to charge a cheap prepaid phone. The worst part was finding my school schedule printed out, probably from the school website, with the times I got home circled in pencil. They arrested him for breaking and entering, trespassing, and theft, though Officer Brennan said he'd likely been homeless and looking for somewhere warm to sleep as the weather turned cold. That didn't make me feel any better about it, knowing he'd deliberately waited until I was alone, that he'd been down there listening to me walking around above him, maybe even coming upstairs when I had headphones on or was in the shower. Dad had a security company come out that same night to install cameras and new locks, sealed up every possible entry point with metal grating and industrial screws, but none of that helped me sleep. For months afterward, I couldn't be alone in the house without checking every door, every window, looking behind furniture and in closets like a paranoid person. Even now, living in my own apartment near campus, I still get this sick feeling when I hear unexpected noises from other units, and I've never once gone into the basement of any building without someone else with me, no matter how well lit or safe it seems. Every November when the leaves start falling and people drag out their rakes, I get this sick feeling in my gut that won't go away. 4 years have passed since that Saturday afternoon when everything changed, but I can still smell the wet leaves mixed with gasoline whenever autumn rolls around. I'd just moved to this neighborhood in Michigan about 6 months before, landed a job at a marketing firm downtown, and was finally feeling like I belonged somewhere after bouncing between apartments since college. My neighbor Jason had invited me to what he called their annual leaf-burning party, which was basically an excuse for everyone on our block to drink beer and pretend they were actually cleaning up their yards. Jason lived 3 houses down from me in one of those split-level homes with the huge backyard that backed up to a small wooded area. His wife Amanda had strung up these orange lights between the trees, and someone had brought over a couple of folding tables loaded with chili, cornbread, and those pumpkin-shaped sugar cookies from the grocery store. There were maybe 15 of us there, mostly couples in their 30s and 40s, plus a few single people like me who'd gotten absorbed into the neighborhood social circle. Everyone was bundled up in flannel shirts and puffy vests, standing around in small groups while kids ran through the leaf piles screaming and throwing handfuls at each other. Fire pit was this circular metal thing Jason had bought at Home Depot, about 3 feet across, and sitting on a patch of gravel he'd laid out specifically for it. We'd been trying to get a decent fire going for about 20 minutes, but everything was working against us. It had rained hard for 3 days straight earlier that week, and even though Jason had covered his wood pile with a blue tarp, moisture had gotten into everything. The logs would smoke and hiss but wouldn't catch properly, just producing these pathetic little flames that kept dying out. People were starting to make jokes about calling it quits and just using the propane heater on the deck, but Jason was determined to get that fire roaring. I was standing by the cooler grabbing another beer when I heard Brandon, this guy who lived at the end of the street, say he had a gas can in his truck from filling up his lawnmower that morning. Brandon was one of those guys who always had to be the problem solver, the one with all the answers and the right tools for every situation. He jogged over to his F-150 parked on the street and came back with a red plastic gas can, the kind with the long yellow spout. Most of us were too busy talking or watching our kids to really pay attention to what was happening next, which is something I think about constantly now, how differently things might have gone if just one person had said something. Megan was standing right there next to the fire pit, holding her daughter Sophia, who'd just turned 3, and was wearing this tiny pink winter coat with fur around the hood. Megan had graduated from Michigan State the same year I finished at Western, though we didn't know that until later, and she'd been nothing but welcoming since I moved in. She was showing Sophia how the smoke was rising up into the sky, pointing at it with one hand while balancing the kid on her hip. The wind had been pretty calm all afternoon, just a gentle breeze that would occasionally stir the leaves around our feet. But right as Brandon started pouring that gasoline, a gust came out of nowhere from the north. What people don't understand about gasoline is that it's not the liquid that's dangerous, it's the vapor. On a cold day like that, maybe 40 degrees, the fumes don't dissipate as quickly as you'd think. They hang in the air, invisible, building up in pockets, especially when there's no wind to carry them away. Brandon poured what he later said was just a splash, but I watched that stream of gas flow for at least 3 or 4 seconds, soaking into the damp wood and pooling at the bottom of the fire pit. He tossed the can aside and pulled out his lighter, one of those long barbecue lighters with the trigger, and that's when everything went wrong in a way that still plays behind my eyelids when I try to sleep. The wind shifted right as Brandon clicked the lighter, and instead of the fire starting in the pit where he was aiming, the flame hit that invisible cloud of vapor that had drifted toward Megan. It wasn't like a movie explosion with people flying backwards. It was more like the air itself became orange and hot for half a second. This whooshing sound that I can only compare to when you open a preheated oven and that blast of heat hits your face, except multiplied by 100. Megan screamed, a sound I'd never heard a human make before, raw and primal, and she instinctively turned her body to shield Sophia, which meant her back and the side of her neck took the worst of it. The smell hit me immediately, Not like barbecue or campfire, but something chemical and wrong, mixed with burning polyester from her jacket. Everyone moved at once then, Jason running for the garden hose, Amanda screaming for someone to call 911, Brandon standing there with the lighter still in his hand, looking like his brain couldn't process what had just happened. I dropped my beer and ran to Megan, who had managed to set Sophia down safely, but was now on her knees in the grass, reaching behind herself trying to get her jacket off. Her husband Nathan came out of nowhere, must have been inside using the bathroom, and when he saw her he made this choking sound that turned into him yelling her name over and over. I helped him get the jacket off her while trying not to look at what was underneath, but you can't unsee something like that, the way skin bubbles and turns white in some places, angry red in others. The ambulance took 11 minutes to arrive, though it felt like hours. Amanda had grabbed Sophia and taken her inside along with the other kids, trying to distract them with cartoons while the adults dealt with the chaos outside. Someone had found a clean sheet from Jason's linen closet, and we carefully draped it over Megan's burns while she sat on the ground, rocking slightly and making these small, whimpering sounds. Nathan held her hand and kept telling her she was going to be okay, but his face was white as paper, and his voice cracked every time he spoke. The EMTs were efficient and professional, getting an IV started right there on the lawn, giving her something for the pain that made her eyes go unfocused and drowsy. After they loaded Megan into the ambulance with Nathan climbing in beside her, the rest of us just stood there in Jason's backyard like we'd forgotten how to move. The fire pit was still smoldering, producing this thin black smoke that made my eyes water. Or maybe that was something else entirely. Brandon hadn't said a word since it happened, just stood by his truck staring at the ground, and when the police showed up to take statements, he could barely get the words out. They determined it was an accident, no charges filed, just a catastrophically stupid decision that couldn't be undone. The officer taking my statement said these kinds of things happened more often than people realized, especially in the fall, when everyone was burning leaves and trying to get fires started with wet wood. Megan spent 3 weeks in the burn unit at University Hospital, underwent 4 different skin graft surgeries over the next 8 months, and still has to wear compression garments on her neck and shoulder. The scars are there, will always be there, this twisted map of that November afternoon permanently etched on her skin. She and Nathan moved away the following summer, said they found a better school district for Sophia, but we all knew the real reason. Every time they looked at that backyard 3 houses down, every time they saw Brandon's truck parked on the street, they were right back in that moment. Brandon lasted another year before he sold his house too. Told me at the closing that he hadn't slept a full night since the accident, that he'd started seeing a therapist but couldn't shake the guilt of what his impatience had caused. I still live on that street, still see Jason and Amanda at the grocery store, still wave when I pass their house on my morning runs. They never had another fall gathering after that day. Nobody in the neighborhood did. We rake our leaves into bags now, haul them to the curb for the city to collect, and nobody mentions the obvious absence of autumn bonfires. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I run through all the moments where someone could have stopped it, where I could have stopped it. If I'd just looked up from that cooler 5 seconds earlier, if I'd seen Brandon with that gas can and said something, anything. But I didn't. None of us did. And now Megan lives with the consequences of our collective inaction every single day of her life. Quitting my job at the insurance company felt like finally taking off shoes that were 2 sizes too small. I'd spent the better part of my 20s working toward what I thought I was supposed to want, and by September, I just couldn't do it anymore. My parents were horrified when I turned in my resignation without another position lined up. But I had savings, I had time, and honestly, I needed to figure out who I actually was outside of spreadsheets and client calls. The plan wasn't complicated. Spend the fall hiking every trail I could find within driving distance of my Vermont apartment, clear my head, maybe stumble into some kind of clarity about what came next. That late afternoon in the final week of the month, I chose Miller's Pass specifically because almost nobody hikes it. The trail doesn't show up on those popular hiking apps, just a straightforward 4-mile loop through dense woods with one rocky overlook roughly halfway through. When I pulled into the gravel lot around 3, only 2 other cars sat there, and I felt this wave of relief wash over me. Solitude was exactly what I needed. The beginning of the trail delivered everything I'd hoped for. Overhead, the canopy had already shed most of its leaves, creating these skeletal archways where afternoon light slanted through in sharp golden beams. The air tasted like wet earth and rotting foliage, that distinctly autumn mixture of growth and decomposition happening simultaneously. About 20 minutes in, I passed an older man heading back down, expensive hiking poles clicking against rocks, who gave me a brief nod but kept moving. Perfect. I didn't want conversation. The incline increased steadily as I climbed higher, and the leaf coverage got thicker, everything slick and compressed from overnight rain. My boots had good tread, but I could feel them wanting to slide on certain patches. The overlook appeared right when my legs were starting to burn, and the view made the climb worth every step. Hills stretched endlessly in every direction, covered in bare branches with fog pooling in the low spots like spilled milk. I snapped a few photos, ate a granola bar, pulled out my phone to check the time. No signal, which I'd expected. Nearly 4 already, and the quality of light was shifting into that deep amber that signals maybe an hour left before real darkness starts creeping in. The descent from the overlook should have been straightforward. I'd noticed on my way up that the trail curved sharply to the left about 15 feet past the viewpoint, following the natural contour of the ridge. But standing there at the edge, looking down at the valley, I spotted what looked like a shortcut. Just a gentle slope covered in leaves that seemed to angle back toward where the main trail would be, maybe saving me a few minutes of switchbacks. Stupid decision, I know that now. But in the moment, it seemed harmless enough. The slope didn't look that steep, and I'd been hiking for months without incident. I took one step onto the leaf-covered ground, then another. The third step, my boot hit something slick underneath all that organic debris, maybe a wet rock or a rotted log, and suddenly my feet went out from under me completely. I didn't even have time to yell. My hip slammed into the ground first, then I was sliding, rolling, grabbing at nothing but handfuls of wet leaves and loose dirt. Branches whipped past my face, rocks jabbed into my ribs, and the whole world became this chaotic tumble of brown and gray and pain. When I finally stopped moving, I was on my back staring up at the darkening sky through a gap in the trees. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, and every part of my body was screaming. I stayed there for probably 30 seconds, just doing a mental inventory. Fingers moved, toes moved, nothing felt broken exactly, just battered to hell. My left knee throbbed where it had connected with something hard on the way down, and I could feel wetness on my forehead that was probably blood from a scrape. Slowly, carefully, I rolled onto my side and looked around. I'd fallen maybe 20 or 25 feet down into what was basically a ravine, steep walls on 3 sides covered in that same deceptive carpet of leaves. Above me, I could barely make out the edge of the overlook through the bare branches. The main trail was somewhere off to my left, I thought. But down here, everything looked different, disorienting. The light was dimmer, too, filtered through layers of tree trunks, and I realized with a spike of genuine fear that I needed to get back up to the trail before it got dark. I got to my feet, testing my weight on each leg. The knee hurt like hell, but held. My backpack had stayed on somehow, though it felt heavier now, probably from all the dirt and debris that had gotten inside during the fall. I turned toward what I thought was the best route back up, a slightly less vertical section of the slope, and that's when I saw it. A phone, or what was left of one. The screen was completely shattered, spider-webbed into 1,000 pieces, and the case was dark blue with some kind of sparkly design. It was just lying there in the leaves about 6 feet from where I'd landed, face up, like someone had dropped it. My first thought was that maybe I'd knocked it loose during my fall, that it had been buried in the leaves, and I just happened to uncover it. But I checked my pockets and my phone was still there, intact. This was someone else's phone. I picked it up, turned it over. The back was scratched to hell, and when I tried the power button, nothing happened. Dead, or broken, or both. A cold feeling started spreading through my chest, something beyond the pain from my fall. I looked around more carefully now, really scanning the ground instead of just trying to orient myself. That's when I noticed the jacket. It was wedged partially under a fallen branch about 10 feet further down the slope, torn badly along one sleeve. Navy blue, or maybe black, hard to tell in the fading light. The fabric was still damp, not from last night's rain, but from something more recent. I moved closer, my injured knee protesting with each step, and crouched down to get a better look. The tear wasn't just a rip from catching on a branch. The edges were shredded, like the person wearing it had been dragged through something rough, or had desperately grabbed at the ground while sliding. And there, pressed into the wet leaves all around the jacket, were marks. Long, uneven gouges in the earth, the kind that fingernails make when someone's trying to stop themselves from falling. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Someone else had fallen here, recently enough that their stuff was still here, and from the looks of it, they'd been terrified while it happened. I stood up too fast and pain shot through my knee, but I barely registered it. My brain was trying to piece together what I was seeing, trying to make it make sense. Maybe someone had fallen like I did, gotten hurt, and hiked out for help. Maybe they'd come back with rangers to retrieve their stuff and just hadn't made it yet. That had to be it. Except, as I turned to start climbing back up toward the trail, I saw the drag marks. Not the desperate scratches from fingernails, but actual drag marks. 2 parallel lines pressed deep into the soft ground, starting right where the jacket lay and continuing down the slope, disappearing into thicker brush further into the ravine. The lines were maybe 1.5 feet apart, consistent, purposeful, like something heavy had been pulled downhill, like a body. My mouth went completely dry. I followed the marks with my eyes as far as I could see them, maybe another 30 feet before they vanished into a dense tangle of undergrowth and fallen trees. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to climb back up to the trail right now, to get out of this ravine and back to my car, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at those lines, understanding with absolute certainty that whoever had lost that phone and that jacket hadn't walked away from this spot. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant, or maybe that was just adrenaline making me shake. I forced myself to turn away from the drag marks and look back up at the slope I needed to climb. It was steep, covered in those same treacherous wet leaves, and now I understood why there was so much debris down here, why the phone and jacket had ended up in almost the exact spot where I'd landed. This wasn't just a random steep section. This was a place where people fell, where the ground gave way and sent you tumbling whether you wanted to or not. And someone knew that. Someone had been here, had stood at that overlook or somewhere near it, and had watched someone fall. Had maybe even made sure they fell. Then they'd climbed down, found whoever it was, and dragged them deeper into the woods. The evidence was right there in front of me, undeniable and horrifying. I needed to get out of here, needed to get to somewhere with cell service and call the police. But first, I had to climb back up this slope without falling again, and the light was fading fast now, turning everything into shades of gray and shadow. I grabbed onto the nearest tree trunk, testing its stability before putting my full weight on it. My knee screamed in protest, but I ignored it, focusing entirely on finding the next handhold, the next solid foothold beneath the leaves. Every few feet I'd stop and listen, straining to hear anything beyond my own ragged breathing and the rustling of branches in the wind. Part of me kept expecting to hear footsteps above me on the trail, to see a silhouette appear at the top of the slope looking down. The climb took forever. My fingers were numb from gripping rough bark and cold stone, and twice I slipped backward a few feet before catching myself. When I finally hauled myself over the edge back onto the main trail, I collapsed onto my hands and knees, gasping. The overlook was maybe 20 feet to my right, exactly where I'd been standing before I fell. How long had I been down there? 20 minutes, 30. The sky had gone from amber to deep purple, and the first stars were starting to show through gaps in the canopy. I forced myself to stand, every muscle in my body protesting. The parking lot was still over 2 miles away, most of it downhill, but some sections steep enough that I'd need to be careful in the growing darkness. I started moving as fast as my injured knee would allow, half walking, half limping down the trail. The forest around me had transformed into something alien and menacing, every shadow potentially hiding someone, every snapping twig making me jerk my head around. I kept thinking about those drag marks, about how deliberate they'd looked, how recent that jacket had seemed. What if whoever did it was still out here? What if they'd seen my car in the parking lot and were waiting? The thoughts spiraled in my head, feeding my panic, but I couldn't stop them. When I finally saw the trail marker indicating half a mile to the parking area, I nearly sobbed with relief. The light was almost completely gone now, just the barest glow from the western horizon filtering through the trees. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight even though it would drain my battery, and picked up my pace despite the pain shooting through my knee with every step. The parking lot appeared through the trees like a miracle, the gravel pale and visible even in the near darkness. My car sat exactly where I'd left it, and the 2 other vehicles that had been there earlier were gone. I was completely alone. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them once, finally got the door unlocked and threw myself into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, and I just sat there for a moment, door locked, breathing hard, staring out at the trailhead. Nobody emerged from the path, no movement in the shadows. I pulled out my phone again, praying for signal, and watched as 1 bar flickered into existence. Enough. I dialed 911, and when the dispatcher answered, everything came pouring out in a rush. The fall, the phone, the jacket, the drag marks leading deeper into the ravine. She kept me on the line, asking questions about my exact location, whether I was injured, whether I'd seen anyone else on the trail. I told her about the older man I'd passed on my way up, how the parking lot had been nearly empty, how isolated the whole area was. She told me to drive to the ranger station about 15 minutes down the mountain road and wait there, that they were sending someone to meet me. The ranger station was lit up when I arrived, and 2 Vermont State Police cruisers were already there. I spent the next 4 hours telling my story over and over, first to the rangers, then to the state police, then to a detective who showed up around 8. They took photos of my injuries, my muddy clothes, the scrapes on my hands. Around midnight, they told me search and rescue teams were heading up to Miller's Pass at first light, that they'd already contacted the phone company to try identifying the owner of the device I'd described. A female officer drove me home because they didn't want me driving with my knee in that condition. She was kind, told me I'd done the right thing reporting it immediately. 2 days later, a detective called my apartment. They'd found remains in the ravine, exactly where the drag marks had led. A hiker named Vincent Riley reported missing 3 weeks earlier after telling his roommate he was going to Miller's Pass. But that wasn't all they found. Once they started looking carefully at that section of trail, they discovered evidence of at least 2 other incidents in the past 6 months. Disturbed earth near the overlook, more personal items deeper in the woods. Within a week, they'd arrested a local man named Gregory Walsh who did trail maintenance for the Forestry Service. He'd been using his knowledge of the area's most isolated paths, watching for solo hikers on quiet weekdays when nobody else was around, then following them to the overlook and pushing them when the moment was right. The autumn leaf cover and early sunset gave him perfect conditions. They said if I hadn't fallen and found that evidence, if I hadn't reported it immediately, he probably would have kept going indefinitely. I haven't been back to Miller's Pass, and honestly I don't know if I ever will. My knee healed after about 6 weeks of physical therapy, but the mental part took longer. For months afterward, I couldn't hike alone without constantly looking behind me, couldn't enjoy the solitude I'd been craving when I quit my job. The trial happened last spring, and I had to testify about what I'd found in that ravine. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to the prosecutor lay out the timeline of Walsh's crimes, hearing the families of the other victims, It hit me how close I'd come to being one of them. If I'd arrived an hour earlier when he was still on the trail, if I'd been slower and encountered him on my way back down in the darkness, if he'd seen me climb out of that ravine. The detective told me later that Walsh had actually walked past my car in the parking lot that afternoon, that they'd found his truck parked on a service road a quarter-mile away. He'd been there. I still hike, because I refuse to let him take that away from me. But I'm careful now in ways I never was before. I check trail reports, I tell people exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. And I never ever go out alone on empty weekdays in the late afternoon. Some fears are worth keeping. The drive between Harrisburg and Carlisle takes about 40 minutes if you stick to Route 74, cutting through farmland and patches of forest that turn absolutely gorgeous when the leaves change. I'd been making that commute twice a day for 6 months, ever since landing the accounting job downtown. Most people from my 2012 graduating class had already moved closer to their workplaces, but I actually enjoyed the separation between office life and home, even when it meant spending over an hour in the car daily. By mid-fall, though, the beauty had mostly faded. The trees stood bare and gray against the sky, and daylight disappeared earlier each week. Leaving the office at 6:30 meant driving home in total darkness, just my headlights cutting through the night, and maybe 1 or 2 other cars passing by every few miles. That Wednesday felt particularly draining. I'd spent 9 straight hours hunched over spreadsheets, working on a complicated estate case my boss had dropped on my desk that morning. 5 years of financial records to sort through, and my eyes felt like sandpaper by the time I finally shut down my computer. All I could think about was getting home, microwaving some leftovers and melting into my couch. The temperature had plummeted that week, one of those sudden cold snaps where you wake up and suddenly realize winter is right around the corner. I stopped at the gas station just outside Harrisburg to fill up and grab coffee, and Bill, the older guy who worked evenings there, warned me to watch for deer on the back roads. "They're real active this time of year," he said, handing me my change. I thanked him, clutched my coffee like a lifeline, and headed back out into the frigid darkness, completely clueless about what was actually waiting for me out there. Route 74 gets pretty desolate once you leave the Harrisburg suburbs behind. During the day, you'll see farmers working their fields, maybe some kids waiting at bus stops, the occasional roadside produce stand. At night, especially in late fall, it becomes a different place entirely. Just empty asphalt stretching ahead, broken up by the rare porch light from a farmhouse set way back from the road. The forest presses in close on both sides in certain stretches, and your high beams only reach so far before everything dissolves into blackness. I'd gotten used to it over the months, even found it peaceful in a way. That night, about 20 minutes into my drive, I was sipping my coffee and half listening to some podcast about true crime, ironically enough, when my headlights caught something up ahead on the right shoulder. A pickup truck sat partially off the road, hazard lights blinking orange in the darkness. The hood was propped open, and a figure stood beside it, illuminated in that weird flickering glow. As I got closer, I could make out more details. Older model Dodge Ram, dark green or maybe brown, hard to tell in the poor light. The person was wearing a thick winter coat and a baseball cap, waving one arm slowly back and forth like they were trying to flag someone down. My first instinct was to keep driving. I'd heard plenty of stories about scams and dangerous situations, and a lone person on a deserted road at night definitely triggered some alarm bells. But then I thought about how cold it was, how infrequently cars pass through this stretch, and how terrified I'd be if I were the one stranded out here. The internal debate probably lasted 3 seconds, but it felt longer. Finally, against every true crime podcast I'd ever listened to, I eased off the gas and started slowing down. I pulled up about 15 feet behind the truck and put my car in park, leaving the engine running. Through my windshield, I could see the person more clearly now. Average height, stocky build, the baseball cap pulled low. They turned toward my car and I rolled down my window maybe 4 inches, just enough to talk through. "Hey, you need help?" I called out. The person walked toward my car, moving with this odd measured pace that made my chest tighten a little. When they got close enough, I noticed their face was partially obscured by a thick scarf wrapped around the lower half, which made sense given the temperature, but also made it impossible to read their expression. "Yeah, truck just died on me," they said, voice muffled through the scarf. "Battery's dead, I think. You got jumper cables?" I didn't, actually. I'd been meaning to buy a set for months but kept forgetting. "Sorry, no," I said, and I was about to suggest calling a tow truck when they took another step closer to my door. That's when every nerve in my body suddenly started screaming at me. The person's hand moved to their coat pocket, and in one fluid motion, they pulled out a handgun. Not some little pistol either, but a full-sized revolver that looked massive in the glow of my headlights. "Turn off the car and get out," they said, voice completely flat now, no panic or hesitation. My brain couldn't process what was happening. This felt like a scene from a movie, not something that could actually be happening to me on my regular Wednesday commute home. "Get out of the car now," they repeated, louder this time, and raised the gun so it was pointing directly at my face through the window gap. My whole body went into this weird autopilot mode. I didn't think, didn't plan, just acted on pure survival instinct. Instead of turning off the engine, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The Corolla lurched forward, tires squealing, and I heard a loud bang that might have been a gunshot or might have been my door slamming against something. I didn't look back to find out. My only thought was, get away, get away, get away. But I'd only made it maybe 30 yards when I realized the horrible truth. The road ahead curved sharply to the left, and in my panic, I'd accelerated way too fast. I hit the brakes hard, but the Corolla skidded on some wet leaves scattered across the asphalt. The car went sideways, and then I felt the sickening crunch of the front passenger side slamming into a drainage ditch. The impact wasn't severe enough to deploy the airbags, but it was definitely severe enough to stop me dead. The engine sputtered and died. I tried restarting it, turning the key again and again while my heart hammered against my ribs, but all I got was a grinding noise and then nothing. Through my rearview mirror, I could see a flashlight beam bobbing in the darkness, getting closer. They were coming after me on foot. I had maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. I grabbed my phone from the cup holder, shoved it in my jacket pocket, and threw open the driver's side door. The cold air hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't hesitate. I ran straight into the woods on the left side of the road, branches whipping at my face and arms as I crashed through the underbrush. The forest was pitch black away from the road, and I had no idea where I was going. I just pushed forward, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that person with the gun. Low branches caught my hair and scratched my cheeks. I tripped over a fallen log and went down hard on my knees, the impact sending a sharp pain shooting up my legs. Behind me, I could hear thrashing sounds, the snap of breaking twigs. They'd followed me into the woods. I scrambled back to my feet and kept moving, one hand stretched out in front of me to avoid running face first into a tree trunk. My breath came in ragged gasps that sounded way too loud in the quiet forest. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, I spotted a massive oak tree with a hollowed-out section at its base, probably from rot or lightning damage years ago. Without thinking twice, I wedged myself inside, pressing my back against the rough wood and pulling my knees up to my chest to make myself as small as possible. Then I forced myself to stop moving, stop breathing so hard, and just listen. The woods went silent for a moment, just the sound of wind moving through the bare branches above. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the dry leaves maybe 40 or 50 feet away. The flashlight beam swept back and forth, creating crazy dancing shadows between the trees. "I know you're out here," the person called out, voice echoing slightly in the empty forest. "Might as well come out. You can't hide forever, and that's a long walk back to civilization." They were trying to flush me out, I realized, trying to make me panic and run again so they could track the noise. I bit down on my sleeve to keep from making any sound and stayed absolutely still inside that hollow tree, even though every muscle in my body was screaming at me to bolt. The beam passed within 10 feet of my hiding spot, close enough that I could see the individual particles of bark on the trees around me. I closed my eyes, some childish part of my brain thinking that if I couldn't see them, they couldn't see me. The footsteps paused. My lungs burned from holding my breath. Then, after what felt like a decade, the footsteps started moving again, heading away from me, deeper into the woods in the wrong direction. I waited until I couldn't hear anything anymore before I dared to move. Even then, I counted to 300 in my head, forcing myself to stay hidden just in case it was a trick. When I finally crawled out of the hollow, my legs had gone numb from being cramped in that position, and I nearly fell again. I pulled out my phone, and thankfully it still had battery and a weak signal, just one bar. My fingers shook so badly I could barely unlock the screen, but I managed to dial 911. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, and I whispered my situation as quietly as I could while still being understood. She stayed on the line with me, her calm voice the only thing keeping me from completely losing it, and told me to head back toward the road but stay hidden in the tree line. State police were already on their way. It took me almost 20 minutes to work my way back, moving slowly and carefully, stopping every few feet to listen. When I finally saw the flashing red and blue lights through the trees, I actually started crying from relief. 3 state police cruisers had blocked off the road, and an ambulance sat parked nearby with its lights running. The officers found me stumbling out of the woods, covered in scratches and dirt, probably looking half dead. They wrapped me in one of those foil emergency blankets and sat me in the back of an ambulance while a paramedic checked me over. I told them everything, talking so fast the words tumbled over each other. The truck, the gun, the crash, running through the woods. While I was giving my statement to one officer, I watched another team examining my Corolla, still nose down in that ditch. A third officer walked up holding an evidence bag, and inside it I could see my driver's side mirror, completely sheared off. "Found this about 10 feet from your vehicle," he said. "Looks like maybe a bullet clipped it when you took off." That made everything feel horribly real all over again. The person had actually fired at me. If I'd hesitated even 1 second longer, if I'd been sitting differently in my seat, that bullet could have gone through the window instead of hitting the mirror. The officer told me I'd done exactly the right thing by running and hiding, that trying to comply or reason with someone like that in such an isolated area rarely ends well. The attacker had vanished, but they'd left the truck behind in their escape. Over the next week, I learned the full scope of what had been happening. That green Dodge Ram had been reported by multiple people over the past month, always in the same general area, along Route 74 and the connecting back roads. Hunters heading out to their stands before dawn had seen it parked in different spots, always with the hood up, always looking disabled. One guy had even stopped to help 2 weeks earlier but said the driver waved him off, claiming a friend was already on the way. Authorities figured the person had been staging these fake breakdowns specifically during fall, when the combination of fewer cars, early darkness, and hunting season meant plenty of vehicles traveling alone on rural roads. They were targeting solo drivers during that narrow window of time, when someone would be both vulnerable and potentially carrying hunting equipment or money. Police found camping gear in the truck bed, suggesting they'd been staying somewhere nearby between attempts. They ran the plates and discovered the truck had been reported stolen from a parking lot in Hershey 3 months prior. DNA evidence and fingerprints eventually led them to someone with a history of armed robbery in 2 other states, and they arrested him at a motel outside of Chambersburg 6 days after my encounter. I had to identify him in a lineup, and seeing that face again, even through protective glass with officers all around me, made my chest tighten with the same terror I'd felt that night. He's serving 15 years now, though that hardly feels like enough given what he'd been doing, and what he'd planned to do to however many other people he could ambush out there. I take Interstate 81 to work now, even though it adds 20 minutes to my commute. I don't care. Some roads aren't worth the shortcut, and I'll never look at a stranded vehicle the same way again. The colder nights always seem to sneak up on us around the start of November, and that particular year wasn't any different. My life back then was pretty steady. Long shifts at the auto shop, kids busy with school projects, and my wife juggling her work-from-home schedule. Our house sat on a quiet street lined with maples that turned this deep copper color, the kind that looked almost wet after sunset. We weren't prepared for the sudden temperature drop, so we dug through the garage looking for that old space heater we hadn't touched in a long time. I remember brushing off a layer of dust that had settled unevenly across its metal grate, like a film of ash. It felt harmless, just a temporary fix until we bought something newer. Nothing about that moment hinted that the rest of the night would carve itself into my memory. The day had been ordinary enough that I didn't pay attention to the little things, like how the garage smelled faintly of dried leaves and something stale, or how a few cardboard boxes had sagged from moisture during the summer. We set the heater in the corner of the living room, near an outlet that had always been slightly crooked, tilted just a bit downward as if the wall had shifted over time. I remember feeling relieved when that heater hummed to life, the coils glowing this dull orange, giving off that faint metallic scent. The kids sat near it with blankets around their shoulders, laughing at some cartoon, and for a while the warmth felt comforting in a way that made the house seem smaller, cozier. I didn't know that behind that crooked outlet, wires were pressed against wooden beams that had dried out from months of heat. By midnight, the house had settled into that deep stillness that only happens on cold nights. No air conditioning running, no fans buzzing, just the quiet rhythm of everyone sleeping. My dog Riley kept shifting at the foot of the bed, letting out soft huffs like he could sense something I couldn't. I remember waking up briefly because the air felt heavier than usual, almost like the room wasn't cycling it properly. I chalked it up to the heater running for hours, though it wasn't even in our bedroom. Outside, a breeze moved the last brittle leaves around the porch, making this faint tapping sound against the siding. I rolled over and went back to sleep without a second thought, unaware that inside the walls, slow burning embers were crawling upward like they had a destination. It must have been some time before dawn when a faint, distant beep threaded into a dream I was having. At first I didn't understand what I was waking up to. The sound was muted, almost lazy, as if the alarm itself was struggling. When I sat up, my vision was foggy, and there was this smell, sharp, dry, almost like singed paper, floating barely above the air. Riley stood rigid beside the bed, ears pointed toward the hallway. The beeping grew steadier, and I remember stepping into the hallway expecting maybe a burnt outlet or the heater malfunctioning. Instead, I saw a thin haze drifting near the ceiling, moving as if the whole house was breathing in slow, shallow pulses. I didn't panic yet, but something inside me tightened, the way it does when you're trying to make sense of something that doesn't line up. The further I walked down the hallway, the more the air felt strange, dry, almost gritty, like dust stirred up after moving old furniture. When I reached the living room, the haze had thickened into a pale sheet drifting from the far corner, right above the outlet we'd used for the heater. The heater itself was off, but the wall around it looked darker, almost bruised, like the paint had been warmed too long. A faint crackling sound tapped behind the drywall, subtle enough that you'd miss it if the house wasn't so quiet. I remember touching the wall and pulling my hand back because the surface felt warmer than it had any right to be. It hit me then that whatever was happening wasn't just a burnt plug. Something deeper was going wrong. I yelled for everyone to get up, and the kids rushed out of their rooms half asleep, clutching blankets over their shoulders. My wife grabbed her phone and the dog's leash while I tried to keep my breathing steady. The smoke alarm in the kitchen started blaring next, its tone sharper, more frantic than the first one. By the time we made it to the front door, the haze behind us had turned into a rolling cloud that smeared the hallway windows with a pale gray film. Outside, the air felt startlingly cold compared to the heat gathering inside, and our breaths puffed out like steam. The sky was still dark, but there was a faint line of silver light in the distance hinting at morning. I remember feeling torn between relief that we made it out and dread that the house wasn't done with whatever was happening. What I didn't expect was how quickly things escalated. From the front yard, the house looked perfectly normal. No flames, no dramatic glow. Just a quiet suburban home in the early morning stillness. But within minutes, the windows facing the living room fogged over from the inside, each one turning opaque like frosted glass. A low thump echoed from within the walls, followed by a subtle shudder that ran along the siding. One of the neighbors walked out in a robe, rubbing his arms against the cold, asking if everything was all right. I could barely answer because I was watching a dull orange bloom behind the living room curtains, spreading upward like it was climbing toward the ceiling. It was surreal, seeing the fire announce itself only after it had already grown strong enough to choke the inside. When the fire trucks arrived, the firefighters moved with a kind of practiced urgency, pulling hoses and axes while the rest of the neighborhood gathered on driveways. One of them ran a gloved hand along the siding near the outlet wall and muttered something to his partner that I couldn't catch, but the expression on his face told me it wasn't good. As they breached the front door, a wave of dark smoke spilled out so thick it looked almost like fabric being pulled apart. I kept staring at the house, noticing tiny details I'd never paid attention to before. The crooked mailbox, the chipped paint on the railing, the way the porch light flickered even though it wasn't supposed to be on. All of it suddenly felt fragile, like the life we'd built there had been balancing on a thin edge without us realizing. And for the first time that morning, the reality of losing the place began to sink in. A few hours later, once the flames were finally out, the house looked like a hollowed-out shell. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and the front windows had melted into warped shapes that barely resembled glass. A fire investigator walked the perimeter with a flashlight even though the sun was already up, angling the beam into gaps in the siding like he was searching for something hiding in there. When he approached me, he spoke gently, asking about the heater, the outlet, the last time anything electrical had given us trouble. I told him about a faint buzzing sound we'd heard during the summer near that same wall, something we brushed off as pests moving around. He nodded in a way that made me feel like that tiny detail mattered more than I realized. Later that afternoon, he brought me behind the house to show where the fire had likely started. The wooden beams inside the wall were scorched in a way that created this uneven pattern, almost like a trail snaking upward. He explained that the wiring had probably dried out during the heat waves earlier in the year, leaving the insulation brittle. On top of that, rodents looking for warmth had nested in the walls, chewing through parts of the wiring. When we plugged the heater into that outlet, it stressed the damaged wires just enough to spark a slow-burning fire. The worst part was when he mentioned that an inspection years ago should have caught some of the flaws. Hearing that felt like someone had pulled a rug from under me. All that time we'd trusted the house more than we should have. As night fell, the smell of burnt wood lingered in the air long after the last firefighter truck left. Neighbors stopped by throughout the evening, bringing blankets, offering their guest rooms, sharing stories of old wiring issues they'd ignored. One of them pointed out that everyone was dragging their heaters out of storage now that the temperatures had dropped, and you could see the worry settle across the whole street. Our house had always blended into the neighborhood, just another family home with a trimmed lawn and a squeaky front gate. Now it stood there blackened and marked, like a warning carved into the block. I remember sitting on the back of a pickup someone loaned us, staring at the charred frame and trying to imagine how close we'd come to not making it out. We stayed with relatives for a while, sorting through what could be salvaged and what was gone for good. Even now, I still find myself thinking about that crooked outlet, the one I walked past 1,000 times without giving it a second look. The experience changed the way I see simple things. Old cords, dusty heaters, strange noises in the walls. None of it feels minor anymore. The house was eventually torn down, and a new one stands there now. But every fall when the air turns sharp and people start pulling heaters from storage, I can't help but feel a quiet tension settle in. I don't fully understand how everything lined up the way it did, but we survived, and that's the part I hold on to. A stretch of cool air moving through the neighborhood pushed me to finally switch on the heater that morning, and that's when I learned it wasn't kicking in at all. Work had been hectic around that time, so having the house drop to that uncomfortable chill only added to the stress. I lived alone back then, in a place that wasn't big but had a certain quiet charm, especially when the leaves had just started turning. Calling a repair service felt like the obvious move, and I didn't think twice about it. The man who showed up later that afternoon introduced himself as Eric, wearing a dark jacket with a stitched patch that looked official enough for me not to question it. He had this calm, almost overly practiced way of talking, the kind that makes you feel like you're interrupting a script he's memorized. He asked to head straight to the basement to look at the unit, moving with a steady confidence like he'd been there 100 times. The basement in my house was one of those older ones, low ceiling, pipes running along the walls, and a faint mineral smell that came out strongest on damp days. While he worked, I stayed upstairs listening to the intermittent clangs and metallic scraping drifting through the vents. After about 20 minutes, he came back up, brow creased, saying the whole internal assembly was shot and needed an immediate replacement. It sounded dramatic, but I didn't know much about heaters, and his tone made it feel urgent. He showed me a handwritten estimate on a clipboard, the numbers stacked in a way that didn't leave much room for negotiation. I agreed to the deposit because the temperature was dropping and I didn't want to deal with the house getting colder overnight. After he left, I remember feeling relieved, thinking the worst part was over. But that same evening, I noticed the small ceramic bowl I always kept next to the front door wasn't there anymore. It wasn't valuable, just something I'd picked up at a street fair, but I'd kept my keys in it for years and knew exactly where it belonged. At first, I assumed I'd moved it without thinking, maybe set it somewhere weird while multitasking. I looked around casually and told myself I'd misplaced it, brushing it off as just me being distracted. The next night, when I was heading to bed, I saw that the basement door was slightly open, not wide, but just enough for the darkness behind it to form a thin strip along the frame. I knew I had shut it earlier. The latch was old but still reliable, and I never left it unlatched because drafts from the basement could chill the entire house. I pushed it closed with my foot and stood there for a moment listening to the house settle. There wasn't any noise coming from downstairs, no creaking steps, no shifting pipes, nothing that would give away movement. Still, something gnawed at me, a slow unease that settled beneath my ribs. It didn't feel dramatic enough to call anyone about, but it bugged me the rest of the night. 2 days later, I came home from work and immediately sensed that another item was missing. A small flashlight I kept in a drawer by the kitchen. I used it often enough to know exactly where it belonged, and I hadn't touched it since the week before. That was the moment a strange pattern started forming in my mind. None of the missing things had real monetary value, but they were objects I used, items whose absence I would definitely notice. I checked the basement door again that night and found it unlocked, the latch resting loosely like someone had tried not to make a sound. I stood there longer than I intended, letting the stale air drift up toward me. The silence in the house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were paying attention. I called the number the technician had given me, thinking maybe he'd stopped by without telling me, though that made little sense. The call went straight to a voicemail that didn't mention any company name, just a brief message from a man who sounded half asleep. I hung up before leaving anything. After that, I searched for the business online, typing the name he'd written on the carbon copy invoice. Nothing came up. Not a website, not an address, not even a listing buried in some outdated directory. That was when a cold realization crept deeper into my thoughts. I'd let a complete stranger roam my basement without verifying a single thing about him. That night I pushed a chair against the basement door before going to sleep. Not because I really thought it would stop someone, but because it felt like something tangible I could control. I woke up around 3 in the morning to a sound that was too soft to identify. It wasn't footsteps or voices, more like a faint shifting of air, the kind you hear when someone moves cautiously in another room. I lay still, trying to figure out whether the noise came from inside the house or outside. Eventually the sound faded, but the uneasiness stayed with me long after the house went quiet again. When I checked the basement door later that morning, the chair was slightly angled away from where I'd left it. I contacted a real HVAC company that afternoon, one with an actual storefront and licensed workers. The technician who arrived, a guy named Marcus, looked over my system and told me nothing needed replacing. Just a simple ignition issue, fixed in under 30 minutes. When I showed him the invoice the other man had left, he lifted an eyebrow and said he'd never heard of that company in his entire career. He also pointed out something I hadn't been paying attention to. The metal casing on the side of the unit had fresh scuff marks, like someone had pried at it without knowing what they were doing. He asked if the previous guy had spent a long time down there, and I felt my throat tighten as I admitted I hadn't checked on him once. I spent the rest of that day walking from room to room, noticing tiny details I had overlooked before. A window in the laundry room was unlatched. A rug near the back door was shifted just slightly, its corner bent in a way I would never leave it. None of it screamed danger on its own, but together it painted a picture I didn't want to admit I was seeing. When the sun went down, the house slipped into that dim, early fall darkness that seems to arrive too quickly. I turned on every light I could, trying to push back the uneasy feeling creeping through the hallways. Every shadow felt deliberate, every sound too precise to be just the house settling. The breakthrough came later that evening when I checked the basement again. Something told me to grab a flashlight and take a real look, not just peek from the top of the stairs like I'd been doing. The air down there felt cooler than usual, and the faint hum of the furnace made the silence feel even more unnatural. When I reached the far corner, I noticed a small patch of the wall where dust had been disturbed, like someone had leaned against it. Nearby, behind a stack of boxes, I found a single leather glove. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't old. That discovery sent a ripple through me, clarifying everything I'd been dancing around. Someone had been coming and going through that basement after the fake technician left. The final confirmation came when the police ran the name and number from the invoice. Neither belonged to a real business. The officer I spoke with told me they'd seen similar reports in nearby areas. Someone posing as a technician during the first cold spell of the season, using the basement access to quietly check layouts of homes. Small items disappearing was typical, he said, a way for the intruder to gauge how attentive the homeowner was. Hearing that made something click, the unlocked doors, the shifted chair, the noises in the night. He advised me to change every lock in the house and install a deadbolt on the basement door immediately. I didn't hesitate for a second. The new locks went on that same evening, and I've never scheduled maintenance work the same way again. Every company gets vetted, every technician confirmed before I let them near the property. After the locks were replaced, the strange disturbances stopped completely. No more missing items, no more unlatched doors, no more sounds drifting through the vents at night. I don't know what the intruder planned to come back for, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. What stays with me most is the thought of how close I came to letting something far worse unfold right under my nose. Even now, whenever the first cold snap rolls in, I can't help but think back to that week and how a routine service call nearly became something much darker. My overnight shifts at a small supermarket had settled into a weird kind of routine by late November, the kind where the dark feels heavier each night, and the silence starts to sound like it has weight. I'd been working there long enough to know every hum of the refrigerators and every flicker from the old lights near the dairy aisle. The building sat on the edge of a quiet commercial strip, and once the last customer left, the temperature inside always dipped fast, no matter how high we pushed the heater. That night, I remember walking in with a thermos of coffee and thinking the place felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that clings to the metal shelves and hangs around your breath. My job was simple enough: restock the items from the pallets delivered earlier in the evening, and make sure the aisles were ready for the morning rush. I didn't mind the solitude. It usually gave me space to think, and the emptiness made the hours pass in a strangely peaceful way. Aisles 12 and 13 were part of my rotation for that shift, the sections with cleaning supplies and paper goods. They always smelled faintly like detergent, and for some reason that smell made the whole store feel slightly less abandoned. I'd just finished lining up the last row of bleach bottles, stepping back to make sure everything was straight, when I felt this odd draft slip past me. Not threatening, just unexpected, like someone opened a freezer door nearby. I brushed it off because drafts in that place were nothing new. The building was old, and the insulation wasn't great. After that, I scanned the rest of the aisle, didn't see anything strange, and pushed my cart toward the break room to check the clipboard with the delivery times. Everything looked exactly how it should have looked at that hour. Quiet, empty, still. When I got to the break room, the delivery log said a truck was supposed to arrive earlier than scheduled. Store policy said I had to check the exterior cameras and confirm they were pulling up before going outside. I typed in the system password, clicked over to the live feeds, and leaned closer to the monitor, because the screen always had this dusty haze no matter how many times we wiped it. The loading dock camera looked normal. No headlights, no movement, just an empty stretch of asphalt. When I switched to the interior feed that covered aisles 12 and 13, a shape caught my eye. A tall figure stood between the rows, not close enough to the camera to show detail, but solid enough to be unmistakably human. At first, I thought it was a glitch. Old systems like ours glitch all the time. But the outline didn't flicker or distort. It just stood there. I stared for a long moment, trying to make sense of how someone could be in that aisle when I had literally been standing there minutes earlier. Alone. I toggled between angles trying to get a clearer view, and that's when it moved. Not smoothly or naturally, more like the figure shifted positions only when the camera switched frames, appearing a little closer each time but never in the act of actually walking. The moment the feed changed again, the shape wasn't centered anymore. It leaned into the blind spot created by one of the support beams, as if it knew exactly where the camera's reach ended. I remember feeling this strange pressure in my chest, not panic, but the kind of tension you get when you sense you're not alone, even though everything around you insists you should be. I clicked through every angle the system offered, hoping one of them would catch a full view of whatever was standing there. But the thing kept slipping away like it was deliberately staying hidden. That was the moment I realized I couldn't sit in that break room and pretend the building was empty anymore. I grabbed the flashlight we kept in the supply drawer, even though the aisles were fully lit, and stepped back onto the floor. The cold felt sharper now, almost like the air had dropped another few degrees while I was in the break room. The store was so quiet that every sound I made echoed slightly. My steps, the faint rattle of keys on my belt, even the hum of the lights overhead seemed louder. When I turned into the main aisle that cut across the store, I tried to convince myself I'd probably see nothing out of place. Maybe the camera had picked up my reflection earlier, or maybe a stray display sign had tipped just right to look human from a distance. But as I walked closer to aisles 12 and 13, something about the silence felt heavier, like the building was holding its breath. The lights down at that end flickered once, just a soft dip, but enough to make the aisle look deeper than it usually did. Aisle 12 was empty when I stepped in, exactly how I'd left it. The rows of bleach bottles stood perfectly lined, and the floor was clean except for a faint scuff mark near the shelves that definitely hadn't been there before. It looked like the kind of mark made by a shoe, one dragging step, not a full stride. I bent down to run my hand near it, more out of curiosity than anything else, and noticed something else at the far end of the aisle. A small stack of neatly folded clothes sat right at the corner, placed as if someone had taken their time arranging them. The shirt on top still had a store tag attached. I hadn't seen that stack earlier. I would have noticed something that deliberate, especially right in my path. My throat tightened a little as I looked around, expecting someone to step out. But the aisle stayed still, the overhead lights buzzing faintly like they were the only things awake in the entire building. I backed out of the aisle and checked the other end where aisle 13 started. And sure enough, there was another stack. This time a pair of jeans folded so precisely it almost looked staged for a display. But we didn't keep stacks like that at the ends of aisles. Everything was supposed to stay inside the shelves. I kept turning my head, scanning each direction, hoping to catch even the slightest movement. The store suddenly felt much larger, every shadow stretching farther than it should. I tried calling out a simple, "Hello," even though my voice sounded too loud in the emptiness. No answer. The chills running through the place weren't from the cold anymore. They came from the sense that someone had been walking right behind me the entire time, staying just out of sight, slipping through gaps I didn't even notice. I stepped toward the front end of the aisle to check the camera blind spot I'd seen on the monitors. It was a narrow angle between two tall shelving units, just wide enough for someone to stand if they pressed their back against the metal. As I approached it, the lights above me dimmed again for half a second, like the power was struggling to keep up with the temperature drop. My footsteps slowed. Halfway down, a sound broke the silence, fabric shifting, like someone brushing against clothing. I stopped and listened, heart thumping in my ears, but the sound didn't repeat. When I reached the blind spot, it was empty. No person, no footprints, no sign anyone had been there except for another small pile of clothes folded with the same unsettling care. And that's when a thought hit me. Someone had been in the store for hours, maybe since before we locked up, using every gap in the cameras to move the same way I walked my stalking routes. The idea made the hairs on my neck rise, and suddenly, the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like something was watching, choosing exactly when to stay hidden. I pulled my phone from my pocket, debating whether it made sense to call for backup or if I was overreacting to some prank or mistake in stalking. Before I could decide, a faint tapping echoed from somewhere near the frozen food section. 3 soft, steady clicks, like someone tapping a nail against metal. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the empty aisles in a way that felt deliberate. I turned toward the sound and started walking, holding the flashlight even though the lights were still on. Each aisle I passed seemed colder than the one before it, and the further I went, the more convinced I became that whoever was moving around in there knew the building better than I did. The tapping stopped the moment I reached the freezers, leaving nothing but the hum of the compressors vibrating through the floor. I stood there scanning the stretch of glass doors and caught my reflection staring back, a reflection that looked more tense than I expected. Right then, the overhead speaker crackled. It was the faintest static, a soft burst like someone had lightly brushed the microphone. Nobody was in the control room. Nobody should have been anywhere near the intercom system. I stepped backward slowly, watching the ceiling as if the speaker itself might move. Another low burst of static slipped through, this one lasting a little longer, almost enough to sound like a breath. I whispered a quick, "Who's there?" without thinking, and the silence that followed felt unnaturally complete. The kind of silence where even the normal store sounds seemed to shrink away. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and forced myself to walk toward the front registers where I had a clearer view of most aisles. If someone was hiding, I wanted to catch them crossing the open floor. No more guessing, no more blind spots. Halfway to the registers, I heard something I still can't explain. Clothing rustling, but not the subtle kind. This was like someone rifling through a whole pile of garments at once. The sound came from aisles 9 and 10, a place I'd stalked earlier in the night that had been perfectly organized before I moved on. I turned the corner and found several more folded stacks placed deliberately across the aisle floor, each spaced about 6 feet apart. Shirts, pants, even a jacket that looked like it had been laid out for someone to change into. None of it belonged on that aisle. My pulse thudded in my ears as I scanned every shelf, every corner, expecting a person to jump into view, but the aisle was empty from end to end. The only movement came from a long piece of plastic wrapping drifting gently near a shelf, as if someone had brushed past it seconds before I arrived. I didn't waste time pretending it was a misunderstanding anymore. I turned around and headed straight for the office to call the police. The walk felt twice as long as usual, like the store had stretched itself out. With every step, I expected to hear footsteps behind me or see a shadow slip across the tiles. Nothing happened, but the sense of being guided, herded almost, followed me the whole way. When I shut the office door behind me, The thin wooden panel felt far too flimsy to be any real protection. I dialed emergency services, gave them the address, and made it clear I wasn't alone in the building. The operator told me to stay put, and while I waited, I watched the store monitors again. This time, the tall figure appeared in a different aisle, closer to the front, leaning just enough into frame to make its presence undeniable. The moment the cameras cycled, it slipped out of sight again. I sat there gripping the edge of the desk, counting the seconds until help arrived, knowing I wouldn't set foot back on that floor alone.